Good morning or evening or afternoon or whatever it is where you're at. This is our help session for the 19th of November, 2015. And we are going to cover a few topics today. We'll see where things take us. We're also open to questions as well, certainly. If you are watching on YouTube, I'd recommend and kind of encourage you to head on over instead to the Google Plus page. You can find that by doing a search for Curtis Judd Audio. I actually have two profiles over on Google Plus. It's the Curtis Judd Audio one that you're looking for. And once you get there, you can see that today's help session will be posted there. We'd love to have you join there. And the reason for that is that you can submit questions there. For those that are in the class, you should have received an email that gives you the link to actually join the help session or the hangout on Google Plus, and you can ask your questions live. And you also don't have to use your webcam if you're not comfortable with that. So totally understand if that's how you'd prefer to do it. All right. A few things I've had a few experiences this week. Wanted to tell you a little bit about each of them and sort of in my sound journey. First of all, the first thing I wanted to talk about was Rode Link. And this is the relatively new digital wireless system. Came out earlier this year from Rode Microphones. It transmits its channel and its information in a digital signal as opposed to analog, like a lot of the previous, or actually even very much in current use, wireless lavalier systems or wireless microphone systems. So in the film world, probably the biggest two that I'm aware of. There are others as well, but probably the biggest two on the high end is Electrosonics. Their gear is very expensive, very, very well made, very, very high quality stuff. And then kind of amongst indie filmmakers and those on a tighter budget is typically Sennheiser's G3 wireless system. So there are others, as I mentioned, but those are probably the two most popular and the two that I've encountered the most. And those work great. And there are lots of things you can do with those, and they have worked reliably for a number of years for lots of filmmakers. But then there are the newest ones. The digital systems have just sort of started rolling out in the last few years. Rode Link was one of them. Audio-Technica also has one. Sennheiser has their AVX system now, which is a digital system. And there are, plenty of others. We reviewed the Asden, has a little kind of a lower end one that works surprisingly well. So in any case, I was using my Rode Link and had the transmitter on the Talent. And this is kind of a unique situation here, so this is why I wanted to tell you about it. Not unique, but kind of a acid test, I guess. And then I had the receiver connected to my Zoom F8 audio recorder. So that was and I was probably, I would say, he moved around a lot. The speaker moved around a lot. And this was just sort of a general videography gig for me. This was, nothing complicated, just a speaker, an audience, me in the back operating camera and recording sound for a 30-minute, 35-minute talk. And anyway, I was probably 15 meters away from the speaker most of the time. He moved around quite a bit. 150 people in the room. I would guess that probably at least 3/4 of those people had their smartphones with them, with the radios on. They were at their place of employment. So I'm also going to guess that a lot of those phones had their Wi-Fi turned on and were connected to a local Wi-Fi network. There were more than 10. My phone can only detect 10 available Wi-Fi networks, so that it saw as many as it could show me. So there were plenty of that. And so I really kind of saw this as an acid test to see how well Rode Link would hold up under those circumstances. And what I found was it had absolutely no issues at all for the entire. I had them connected for about 40 minutes and no issues whatsoever for 40 minutes, no drops, no interference that I experienced. I was actually pretty impressed. I was not sure that was going to be the case. This was I was asked to do this a day before. They said, be there. We're not sure if he's going to agree to be recorded, but be there. Please bring your stuff and let's capture this if we can. So I showed up, brought my stuff. The first thing they needed to do was ask his permission to be recorded. I got him logged up. He was wearing a sport coat and we didn't hide it. This is just a talk, and there was no like a public speaking kind of thing. So there's no reason to hide it. He was wearing a sport coat. We just put it up on his lapel. He was, there were the typical issues of he is a speaker who very animated, moves his arms a lot, folds his arms over his chest a lot. So there are some issues there in terms of picking up some of that noise, but absolutely no drops. So I was really, really thrilled with how well RodeLink held up in those circumstances. And I think that's where a lot of pros are still using um, the analog systems because they're concerned about potential interference, especially when you get into a corporate environment or any sort of large environment where you have a lot of people with their phones, a lot of Wi-Fi potential interference, and did well in that particular circumstance. Now, if you're in a stadium with 60,000 people or 30,000 people, or I don't know if there are any stadiums that hold 60. Probably there are somewhere in the world, but um, I don't know how well it's going to hold up in circumstances like that. But I will say that in this case, 150 people, 10 Wi-Fi networks or more, it did just fine. So I was really pleased with that. So just wanted to give kind of an update on that. If you are considering that and that's been holding you back, you're not sure how well it would hold up in circumstances with lots of potential interference. I'm having a really good experience with it. It's holding up pretty nicely. All right, enough on that, I think, unless you have any questions. And again, for those that will be viewing here or are viewing, you can come over to the Google Plus page and submit your questions there if you'd like. One thing we've talked about a lot, now moving to another topic here, one thing we've talked about quite a bit over the last while on my channel on YouTube and in some of the help sessions as well is actually normalizing your audio, loudness normalizing. And one of the things we talked about kind of as the last step is as you loudness normalize, one thing you also need to do is make sure that you manage your peaks. We don't want any of the peaks to hit higher or have a larger amplitude than minus 1.5 dB true peak. And I haven't had a graphic that I could actually illustrate this principle in great detail. So I wanted to show one. As I was actually processing some audio this week, I came across one, and I was practically jumping out of my chair. I was pretty excited about it. But let me show this to you. I have to share my screen. Give me just a second here. And here we go. Okay, this is in Isotopes RX5. And what we have here is just a waveform. We're zoomed way in. You can see these little dots are actually sample points. So you can see we're looking at just a couple of, maybe a millisecond or two here. And as you can see, the waveform follows the samples. But here you can see we have a little bit of problem. So here up at the top in this peak, this sample right here is at 0 dB. That's just the peak measurement. So that's 0 dB right there. But you can see in between this sample and this sample, when it's actually, when the computer actually estimates where the waveform would be between the two, you can see that it actually goes up above 0 dB. And that's what the true peak is in this case. That's where the computer actually has to calculate and estimate what the true peak would be at that point, and it actually goes above. And this is what we want to avoid here. And these are called intersample peaks. So you can see here, this is the type of thing we'd want to be measuring. And that's where we want the true peak to be no larger than minus 1.5 dB. Excuse me. So when we're doing our normalization, that's why we aim for that, because we don't want it to actually, when it gets converted back to analog, to actually peak at that point or actually clip or distort. And that's why we're so concerned with using true peak. Additionally, we've also talked about not exceeding true peak minus 1.5 when we do our normalization. So the reason for that is that while we're working with a file and we're still in a wave format, so we capture the audio in wave format, which is a higher quality lossless format. Once we convert it to a compressed format, and by compressed, I'm not talking about audio compression, but I'm talking about file compression or codec compression. And typically with a video, that's going to go to either AAC format or MP3 format. And these are things that just reduce the file size so it's less to transmit over the internet or less to store on disk or whatever else. When it actually does that conversion from WAV format to these other lossy formats, there can be changes that occur there in terms of the dynamics as well. And that's why we always stay at minus 1.5, because it gives us a little bit of headroom so that when that conversion to the lossy codec occurs, we won't end up with any sort of true peaks that exceed what we're really trying to hit there. So we avoid some of those issues with potential clipping and distorting. So that was one thing I wanted to cover there. And again, if you've got any questions about that, I'd love to hear about that. This will be in the new, the upcoming course that we put together on post-processing for dialogue audio, which will be this will be a smaller course. It'll be a little bit more focused, very, very narrow focus, to be honest. So we're just going to be talking about post-processing dialogue audio, and it's going to be good. Looking forward to that. In fact, over the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States, I'll be working on that, and hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have that available for those that are interested. All right, there's True Peak. Let's see. Next one I wanted to talk about, next topic is high-pass filters. When to use them and why. Now, there are high-pass filters on microphones. There are high-pass filters on recorders. There are high-pass filters you can use in post-production, whether that be in Adobe Audition or your other digital audio workstation of choice. First of all, what is a high-pass filter? A high-pass filter is a filter that removes some of the lowest frequency sound or waveform from your audio. And let me just give you an example here. Here I have this is my Audio-Technica 4053B microphone, and you can see here, just here, there's a little switch. It has a straight line on one side and sort of a curved line on the other side. That is the high-pass filter. When the high-pass filter is off, it's on the straight line. When you engage it, it's on the curved line. And what that's supposed to represent, let's see, it would be this way. Whoops. My camera's all backwards, so I'm trying to figure, yeah, okay. So that's supposed to represent cutting off the low frequencies. So these kind of filters go by a lot of different names. High pass is the most common one, and it's actually a little confusing to most people because you're letting all the high frequencies pass and you're filtering out the low frequencies. Other times it's called a low cut. Sometimes it's called a roll off. There are lots of different names for it. Here's another example. This is a microphone that we're just getting in the process of reviewing. Our last episode was a comparison, actually, an audio comparison of and I didn't reveal them there directly, just indirectly. But the first one was the $600 Audio-Technica 4053B hypercardioid microphone. And then the other one is this one, which I actually have on loan right now. This is the the Sennheiser MKH50. This one is about a $1,200 microphone. This one actually sees a fair bit of use in professional productions, larger budget productions. You can see it also has a high-pass filter right there. So if you see that symbol, typically that's going to be a high-pass filter. In Sennheiser's case, they call it a roll-off filter or just a roll-off. So those are all the same thing. And the question I have, why would you ever want to use those? And in fact, it changes the timbre of the microphone when you turn that on. So you get less bass response. And I think a lot of people, especially when we're first getting started with audio, we're like, why would you want to take all that richness away from that microphone and make them sound a little thinner and not so great? And there actually are cases where you would want to do it. The first one is to remove proximity effect. When you're operating with a microphone within 40 to 60 centimeters, most microphones, most condenser microphones at least, which is typically what we're using for film and video production, will have proximity effect. And what proximity effect means is that when you're close to it, within 40 to 60 centimeters, even a little bit farther back, not much, but it will pick up. It will actually emphasize more bass. It will actually record more bass than is actually there in reality. So that is what is called the proximity effect. And a lot of times, radio announcers, uh, very historically and typically, have used that as an effect. Some musicians use it as an effect. They get up really, really close, and they get that certain sound. And that's a totally legitimate sound if you want to use that for your piece. But if you're trying to get something that sounds a little bit more natural and a little bit more realistic, you probably want to roll some of that off. You probably want to filter some of that proximity effect out. And so that's one reason why you might want to use a high pass filter. And we'll talk about whether it's better to use it on your microphone, your recorder, or in post production in just a minute here. So that's the first case. Second case, it can also help remove rumble and any sort of subsonic material, stuff that's so low frequency that you're not going to hear it anyway. It's just creating, it's being captured as part of the waveform, but it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to hear when you play it back, or it's just really, really low frequency. It's going to be footsteps on floors. It's going to be just this really low frequency stuff that actually isn't necessarily what you're trying to capture in your piece. And in those cases, you can actually remove some of that. And that's another case where it's probably a good idea to use a high pass filter. And finally, another consideration, this is not probably just a different case, but another consideration is and as I mentioned, sometimes microphones will capture subsonic information, subsonic bass frequencies. This is stuff that most of us can't hear anyway. Our ears can't pick it up. And capturing that stuff, to be honest, those low frequency waveforms can actually interact with the material you can hear and actually change it, and usually in ways that you don't want it to be changed. So it does have some phase effect. It does result in some comb filtering where some of the frequencies that you do want get affected in destructive and constructive ways. So things get emphasized that you don't want emphasized, or things get cut that you don't want cut. So that's another case for where you might want to use a high pass filter and remove some of that subsonic material so it isn't affecting your overall audio recording. And that also applies on playback when things are playing back, after you've finished the piece and you send it out or broadcast it on your viewers' playback systems, their speakers or their headphones, they're going to receive that effect too. So it's going to affect the quality of the audio that's played back to them as well. So the problem with these especially low frequency waveforms is that they can really make things sound muddy, and they can really mess with speakers too. And that includes, speakers on headphones, or the drivers in the headphones. So there are a lot of reasons for why you want to roll that off. And I think it's actually generally a good idea to do that because you'll have cleaner, more focused audio, and it'll just sound less muddy, and it'll be a little easier to manage all the other parts of post-processing and sweetening the audio and getting it exactly where you want it to be. So something to consider, something worth taking care of. I would say that there are definitely different ways that you can apply a high pass filter. You can do it at the microphone. You can do it on your recorder, as we mentioned before, and you can also do it in post-processing. Where's the best place to do it? Well, I would typically recommend that you do it either on your microphone or in post-processing, unless you're using a high-end recorder. And let me explain that in a little bit more detail. On some non-high-end recorders, and that's going to include things like my beloved little, can you see this? Yeah, Tascam DR60D Mark II. On my Zoom F8 is also the same case. A lot of times the high pass filter is implemented in the digital stage of the recorder. And by then, some of the damage could have already been done. So I typically, unless you're using a Sound Devices recorder or something like that, a truly professional recorder, you probably want to apply the high pass in your microphone if you can. The problem is that in the little comparison video that I put out earlier this week, the blind comparison of, again, the Audio Technica and the Sennheiser. The second recording was done with the high pass filters engaged. And what was interesting in terms of the comments I've received so far on that video, and one of the things I asked for is, hey, tell me which one you like the sound of better. And almost everyone is voting for the Audio Technica, the microphone that costs half as much as the Sennheiser. And I think part of the reason for that is that on the Audio Technica, the high pass filter is not as extreme. It doesn't cut up as high into the bass range. And as a result, it sounds a little bit richer even when the high pass filter is engaged. And so it's kind of, there's going to be some personal preference there. And when I'm talking about getting rid of some of this low frequency stuff that's just messing things up, I'm talking typically stuff that's, below 50 or 60 hertz. So it's the really, really pretty low end stuff that there's not a lot of that in most voices. Even men with very deep voices are typically not going a lot below 100 hertz, maybe just a little, maybe down into 80 hertz range, but typically not a lot lower than that. So that's what I'm talking about. So the trick is you may or may not want to do it on your microphone, because on your microphone, you may not like the sound of it with the particular mic that you have, and or you may not have a mic that even has a high pass filter, and they're not usually on the lower end microphones. They're typically not on lavalier microphones. So those are all considerations. So for example, with my Audio Technica, I think I will probably plan on using it. I think the high pass filter is implemented at a point where it actually still sounds very good, still sounds very rich for men's voices. But it also takes care of all that low frequency stuff. Oh, and other things that I didn't mention, wind can definitely fall into this category as well. So if you have just a little bit of breeze, if you are recording outdoors, hums and things like, it's not going to totally remove them, but oftentimes things like air conditioners or any sort of electric motor you can also help that by using a high pass filter to cut some of that out as well. So just another thing to consider there. Then if you are going to do it in post-processing, it's fine to do it there. The ideal, I think, would be to actually do it on a microphone if you can. And the reason for that is that when you cut out some of that low frequency material, you're removing some of the constructive and destructive interference that's going to occur. And with that, your amplitude can actually change. So once you've actually removed some of that, the audio can actually get louder in some cases. And you need to know that because, again, when you're doing your recording, you're watching for peaking and you don't want to clip. So that's why it's probably ideal to do it at your microphone if you can. If you can't, then you can't. So you do what you can. And then I would recommend in most cases, again, unless you're using a high-end recorder like a Sound Devices, then you're probably going to want to do it in post-production where you have captured a 24-bit audio stream, and you can then apply that high pass filter in software. And let me just show you here real quick. We may as well. Give me just a second here to pull this up. I'm going to pull up Audition, and we'll put a file in there. Let me just share that with you. We'll just share our entire screen. Okay, here's Audition. Let's pull in some audio. Let's see here. We're not actually going to listen to this, so it doesn't really matter which one I pull in. All right, so if I've got a waveform here, some audio, I might just come up here to Effects, Filter and EQ, Parametric Equalizer, and here's my high pass filter over here on the left-hand side. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the high pass on, and you can see right here it's rolling off those low frequencies. And you have a few options here for how steep you want the curve to be. Here's 6 decibels per octave, 12 decibels per octave, 18, 24. See how it's getting steeper and steeper. I don't think it's necessary to go this extreme typically. I usually go in the 18 to 24 range. Those are going to those are going to cut off pretty much everything you need to get rid of. So, and technically, you're not getting rid of all of it; it's just attenuating it quite a bit. So, and you can also change the frequency. So, if you wanted to come up, I will say, let me just reset this here. I will say that a lot of times on the microphones, it looks something a bit like this. They're probably a lot, some of them are reaching up into the, they're starting to roll off in the 200 hertz range or so. And by the time you get to 100 hertz range, they've attenuated by about, well, here in this case, 10 dB, and then it just falls off from there. So you can experiment with this. The nice thing in post is you can actually kind of fine tune it and figure out how much base material, in your recorded material you want to retain in as much as possible, and how much you want to roll off and attenuate. So that's how you would do a high pass filter in software. Now watch, if we go ahead and let's do this at 24. I'm going to go a little bit more extreme than I typically would go. I'm going to bump it up to 236 is kind of the where it's located right here, but it starts to roll off before that. Watch what happens to the waveform when I apply that. It changed a little bit, and you'll notice now it's actually a little bit asymmetric. So there are some potential costs applying a high pass filter when you do these low end cuts. Um, the rotation of the waveform can get a little bit different, and so you can see here I've lost some headroom. I've got these peaks down here. So this one right here, for example, is at minus almost 1.5, but on the other side of that same peak, it's at minus 7 or so. So that is a consideration. If you're going to start using high pass filters, you're probably going to lose a little bit of headroom. May or may not be a problem. It's not going to sound different necessarily as a result of rotating these waves around a little bit like it has, but you do lose some headroom as far as being able to compress and normalize to where you want to be. So those are all considerations. I hope this is not too complicated or I haven't lost anybody here. Oh, I apologize in advance if I have. So those are some considerations when it comes to high pass filters that I wanted to cover today. All right. I am just going to start on one more topic. I didn't actually plan on talking about this today, but we do still have about half an hour on the schedule here. So I will go ahead and talk about that. Again, if you haven't submitted a question you'd like to, we'd love to invite you to do that. Again, to do that, you have to come over to the Curtis Judd Audio Google Plus page. So go to Google Plus, do a search for Curtis Judd Audio. And then when you get to my profile page, you'll see the help session there. Click on that, and there's a Q&A section there. I'd love to have any questions that you may have. The last topic I'd like to cover today is monitoring. And I'm just getting started on this. I mean, not getting started on monitoring. I've been monitoring for years, but I'm working toward setting up my little room here where I do my post processing and optimizing it for audio playback. And most of us are working. This is a household room. This is a room in my basement. It's my little office and recording post processing suite, I guess. Yeah, it's generous to call it that, but we'll call it that. And this is the kind of place that a lot of us enthusiasts are working in and semi pros. I have a set of monitors that I have had now for probably 5 years. And I'm not endorsing these necessarily. I'm just saying this is what I've got. I've got their KRK Systems rocket powered 8 G2s. I think they have G3 at this point, but I bought them when they were producing the G2. They have 8-inch woofers, and I don't know if the tweeter's a 1-inch or 1.5-inch, but they're big. In fact, let me show you what they look like generally. Give me just a second to pull this up. We will use share my browser there. Okay, these guys, you've seen these before, those with the yellow cones. I have the rocket. and they make several different versions. They have a new 4-inch version. The number here actually refers to the size of the woofer or the low end driver. They have a 5, they have a 6, they have an 8, and they have a 10.3, which is actually a 2.1 system, I think. So it's got two monitors plus a subwoofer. In any case, I have the Rocket 8, and mine looks just a little bit different. They've changed the design a little bit, but you can see tweeter, woofer, and then they have this ported design. A port um, I guess for for those that aren't as familiar with these things, a port is literally just a hole in the cabinet, and it's tuned. I mean, they've done a lot of engineering to get it just right, the way they want it to enhance the sound. And what a port does is it actually allows the monitor to breathe a little bit, and it actually helps produce more. It helps the monitor be able to play lower frequency sounds, and they're often used on less expensive monitors. Some of the more expensive ones will use them too. Um, but there are potential problems with ports. And I didn't know this when I bought my monitors. I was just, you can drive yourself crazy going online and reading about these types of things because there are so many air quote experts out there, and I probably fall into that category too. But here's what I understand so far, and most of what I understand here is things I've learned from the guys over at Sound on Sound. In particular, I think Mike Senior is one who wrote a book about mixing, and it's focused mainly on audio. What is the name of that book? I'll have to pull it up. I don't have it with me right here, but it's called Mixing Secrets or something like that. And anyway, Mike Senior writes an article over at Sound on Sound. And if you're not familiar with Sound on Sound, it's an online web community magazine type thing. But they do some really, really quality stuff. And he has an ongoing piece called, I think it's called Mix Rescue or something like that. But somebody will have recorded something, usually music again, multi-track, and they'll send it over and say, "Hey, I just can't get this thing to sound right. What would you do to fix my mix?" And he goes in and he fixes it up and makes it sound a lot better usually, and talks about the techniques he uses. But in any case, he knows a bit about monitoring. And one of the things he has said is that on lower end monitors, monitors that you spend less than $1,500 US on, having a port is often not a good thing. And yes, while it can produce lower frequency sound, the problem is most of us are working in untreated acoustic environments, rooms, and the the problem with that is that when you start creating all this bass material in those little rooms, it has a tendency to build up and it gets worse. And in addition, these ports will actually start to ring in some cases, and actually a lot of cases. And that can actually mask, you won't be able to hear the actual bass notes on an instrument that are being played because the port is ringing at whatever frequency it rings at. So you'll end up with these one note bass types of issues. So anyway, those are some things that that I'm kind of exploring right now. What I'm exploring actually is he actually recommended, and I'm not saying necessarily to do this, but this was a thing that intrigued me, is he said, if you're dealing with a set of monitors that cost less than $1,500 US, you might want to just stuff those ports with clean socks. Just turn the ports off. And I'm not necessarily recommending that. And maybe that can actually even mess with your monitors and do bad things to them. But I just thought it was kind of interesting. And then acoustic treatment for rooms is a massive, massive topic that, again, it's hard to find great information. But I think what I'm hearing, what seems to be ringing true, apologize for the pun there, but the biggest issue in most small rooms is going to be bass building up in the corners and actually just sitting there and not decaying as quickly as you need it to, not going away as quickly as you need it to. And so it's doing all sorts of comb filtering and messing with your audio overall. So one of the recommendations there for acoustic treatment, the very first thing you want to do is put bass traps in the corners, something that can actually capture and trap and absorb some of that low end frequency material and sort of even your room out. And it's strangely or non-intuitively Doing that will actually make the bass sound better because it's not just lingering there and building up and creating this muddy mess. So you'll actually be able to hear more clarity in your bass and all of your other frequencies when you actually treat your room to manage some of that. So that's a kind of an interesting thing I've been looking at. Also, um, one of the interesting things or the recurring topics that come up over and over and over again is you should never mix on headphones. You hear people say that all the time. Never, never, never mix on headphones. And I think that, I mean, I understand why people would say that. And it makes sense to me. Here's a set of headphones that, but well, let me finish my other topic first here. Why you should not never mix on headphones. Headphones, the nice thing about headphones is that you get a lot less interaction with the room in which you're listening. So that's good, right? You're not going to have as many of those issues with with buildup of bass in the corners and things of that nature. So there is a case in, for at least for part of the time that you're mixing, actually checking your mix or your audio post processing on headphones. There's also the argument that a lot of people these days are actually listening on headphones. So you probably want to listen on what they're going to be listening on. You can't obviously buy every set of headphones out there, but at least getting a representation is a good idea. So there's that argument as well. But there's also a difference um, in terms of different types of headphones that you can use. And you have probably all seen me in the past on these sessions, for example, using the Bear Dynamic. Actually, that's not it. This is a picture of them right here, I believe. Yeah, these are the DT770 Pros. These are closed back headphones. This is the set that I've had for quite a while. Closed back headphones, it turns out, is difficult in terms of design to create closed back headphones that are reference quality, that actually can reproduce all of the frequency ranges that you would typically expect to hear in a nice recording. So closed back headphones generally are probably best for when you're recording. So when you're the sound guy and you're monitoring some recording while you're actually shooting, closed back headphones are probably what you want because you don't want the sound bleeding out of the headphones and then getting captured by the microphone. So usually, um, location sound mixers are going to be using closed back headphones like this, and that's great. However, let's go back to where I was. For post production, you actually probably want something that can capture um, that can actually reproduce and play back higher fidelity sound where you can actually hear all of the frequencies. That's reference quality. That's very clinical. That's actually playing back everything that's in your recording. Um, and they're never going to be perfectly even, but a lot of headphones can do better at reproducing, and giving you a very clear sound to represent what you have captured so you can fix the problems, as opposed to something like a Beats by Dre set of headphones, which are really made to make your music sound awesome. And and they're not typically terribly accurate. They're instead focusing on trying to make the audio or the music sound as great as they can make it sound. And so there's typically going to be more bass in those, more bass than actually is in the recording, and probably more treble. They'll probably do a little bit of a scoop in the middle frequencies, just typically what they do because that's a very appealing sound. So that's kind of a high level description of the differences between different types of microphones. The Bear Dynamic DT880 Pros are probably an example of what is commonly used amongst mixers. Well, one set of headphones is often used. Sennheiser also makes their HD 650s, which a lot of post production people will use as reference headphones. The difference with reference headphones is they're typically open back. So that's not going to be ideal for when you're recording, but because some of the sound will leak out. However, it allows the headphones to produce, again, much better, more accurate sound. So this is a set of headphones that I just picked up recently and just sort of experimenting with them. And we'll see where that ends up. So we'll kind of come back and revisit that whole topic at a future date here. So Um, that is that for now. All right, Gary. Gary, I'm glad to have you here today, and it's actually a different. This is actually a question not about sound so much, but about lighting. How do you deal with slightly different colored lights? Well, that's a great question. We'll go ahead and cover that because, to be honest, I am finished covering my other topics. So I appreciate the question, Gary. And Gary, if you don't know Gary, Gary actually has a YouTube channel called Simple Audio Tips, and I believe that's you, Gary. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it's great to have that question from you. And also, if you haven't seen his channel, I would definitely recommend it. He does some great little pieces on various things related to audio production. So definitely check out his channel on YouTube. It's called again Simple Audio Tips. Well, different colored lights. What I typically try to do, Gary, as far as managing different colored lights, is I try to not use different colored lights. Obviously, not always practical, but if I'm recording in a room, I will often turn off the overhead lights and just use my own lighting. And that's the number one thing. However, if you've got sunlight coming in one of the windows, that's where it's probably going to be best to be using a light source, your own light source that you're adding that is daylight balanced. So that's one thing you can do as well. Um, let me tell you a couple of other things I've done in the past. Once I shot a wedding where we were in a venue and the lighting was awful. And at the last minute, I had to throw a flash on. It was actually off camera, but I had to add flash. And the color of I didn't have time to gel the flash to match the house lights. So this is photography related. It's the same thing with video. Same principles apply. Um, so the house lights were I think they were fluorescent lights that they tried to make look like tungsten lights. So they were this awful color. So they were this orange green kind of color. And this was a part of the ceremony. Now, during the ceremony, I was able to get some other shots that worked just great. But they happened as they were uh, coming out of out of the actual ceremony, walking away from the minister or whatever he was down the aisle. I was capturing these shots, and they had walked in this one part where the lights were really intense on the top of their head. Well, they were spotlights, but anyway, so it looked like the top of their head was orange and the rest of their face was was the regular skin tone color. And it looked awful, but it was a priceless photo. The expressions on their faces were perfect. It was them with, these glowing smiles, all their friends around them clapping and cheering. And I didn't want to lose the shot. And one of the things that they had requested, fortunately in this case, was that we could use black and white as well. And so that was a case where the color mixture was so bad, there was nothing I could do in post realistically to fix that. And so that one got converted to black and white. And in black and white, it was a beautiful, beautiful shot. So you didn't have those issues. But that's a little trick. Obviously, not very practical in a lot of cases. You can't just switch to black and white. That's a last ditch effort kind of thing. But it is another option. In post, it's really difficult to ever fix those kind of things. So that's why it's so important in production to get the lighting right. So yeah, that typically what I do is, again, my LED lights that I'm using these days are the Aperture Light Storms. I got the version that is daylight color, so 5600K, and I'm able to mix that with sunlight very well. They mix beautifully. They have beautiful color rendition. That's another thing. If you're using less expensive lights, especially LEDs and fluorescents, using the really budget stuff, those are always going to be troublesome because they produce a light that's not anywhere close to natural. Their spectrum of light color output is so weird that you probably are going to have issues no matter what. So I would avoid those. I mean, if you are going to be adding light, you really need to do your research and get some lighting instruments that are going to work well. And that's why I ended up with the light storms. The light storms are not cheap. Well, I should say this: they're inexpensive for quality LED panels, but they're not cheap for most enthusiasts. So I think when I bought them, they were, can't remember if they're $600 or $700 each, but they're the equivalent of 1K tungsten light output. So that's a lot of light. And I have 3 of them, and they work beautifully. They can be mixed with sunlight or anything else that's daylight balanced, truly daylight balanced. And so It's a great question, Gary. I would say this is where you have to get the production right. You have to, when you're actually filming, you want to get it right because it'll save a lot of headache later. And I just don't see a way. There's not a really effective way that I know of in post production to really clean that up. You can get into DaVinci Resolve and start doing secondary color corrections. That's a lot of work and time consuming, and often doesn't look great. So I would again say definitely get it right in post. Now, if I didn't answer your question, if I didn't really kind of touch on the topic you were looking for, I'd love to know a little bit more detail about that. But again, thanks for the question, Gary. That's a good one. Speaking of cameras, I don't have any other questions in the queue right now. We have a few more minutes. Um, do I have it here with me? I don't have it here with me. Uh, I had written on my blog, I don't know if you follow the blog, but over at learnlightandsound.com, I write pieces from time to time, just sort of, it's an opportunity for me to kind of put my thought process out in written form. And one of the things I wrote about a while ago is that the Panasonic GH4, which is what I shoot with typically for video, Panasonic released uh, a firmware update that you had to pay for. It wasn't free. And first of all, I think that turned a lot of people off. But that firmware update in particular included what they called vlog-L, which is a log profile. So it's a picture style, if you're familiar with that term, that captures the film in a log format. So it's a very flat looking, gray looking, kind of low contrast type of format. And at first I was very excited. I thought, oh, here, finally I can shoot with the log format that's really designed by a camera manufacturer that knows how to do log on their higher end cameras. And now they're bringing it to the GH4. It'll be awesome to do that. But then I had to take a step back and I'm like, wait a minute. We're talking about a camera that records internally 8-bit 420 color. So that's not a lot of places to put each different color value from the start. And if you're then doing a log capture where it really kind of compresses everything and makes it gray and low contrast, and in post, the idea is that you're then going to take that image and go into some sort of color grading app and clean it up and make it sing and look beautiful and exactly like you wanted it to look and capture all this dynamic range and so on and so forth. The problem with that, when you've recorded it at 8-bit 420 color subsampling, there's not a lot of room to stretch things back out and still look natural. So my stance on it, and I wrote on my blog, is I'm just going to wait and see what other people are getting out of this because it doesn't seem to me that makes a lot of sense. However, for the Panasonic GH4, I actually typically record to the Shogun. So Adamus makes this Shogun recorder, and you send the HDMI signal out the Panasonic GH4 into the Shogun. And when you do that, you can actually record at 10-bit 422 color. So you can get this higher grade color. And in combination with Vlog, that might be an interesting combination. Furthermore, I saw some work that some people had done with the Vlog on Panasonic GH4, and it was actually looking pretty nice. I was actually surprised at how well it looked or how great it looked. So I thought I'd give it a try. It's $100 to add that to your GH4, which, I was like, okay, well, we'll go ahead and try it. Now, just for context, a lot of the professional cameras, when they do come out with updates for the cameras like that, they're usually for pay. So it's not unusual. It's unusual in consumer grade gear, consumer grade cameras, but it's not unusual in professional cameras. And so I think Panasonic raised a lot of eyebrows when they did that with this particular camera. So anyway, I bought it. I got it last night. I installed it, and I'll be experimenting with that over the next little bit. I think that when I'm using my Shogun, it probably makes more sense where I'm capturing 10-bit 422 color. It'll be interesting to see how well this Vlog-L does. Get it outdoors where I have a really dynamic scene in terms of lighting. It'll be interesting to see how well it holds up. So that's a non-sound related topic, but I thought I'd cover that again since we've kind of covered the topics that we had planned to cover already today. So anyway, oh, by the way, I talked about these headphones earlier. Here are the Bear Dynamic DT880s. that I'm working with right now, and then these are actually what they call semi-open back. So again, some sound. I'm just curious here to hear how much sound is actually coming out of with dialogue like this. Not a lot is coming out of the backs, so it's not as if it's going to be messing with a lot of people. And then just a second, let me grab this other pair. And then these are the cans, if you will, or the headphones that I typically use when I'm recording. And these have seen a lot of use. These are my Bear Dynamic DT770 Pros. These are the 80 ohm version. Just something to consider if you are going to buy something you're also going to use just for music playback. The ohm rating is actually pretty important. If you get something that's like a 600 ohm set of headphones, you're not going to be able to listen to those with your phone. You're going to need a better headphone preamplifier or headphone amplifier, excuse me. So, but these work really, really well for recording because, again, none of the sound leaks out into the area where we're doing the recording. Whereas these 880 Pros, I'm just going to start experimenting with these as far as mixing is concerned, in addition to my proper monitors. And I think one of the secrets to monitoring effectively is when you are trying to get used to your playback system, whether those are monitors in the room or headphones or whatever you're using. And again, there's a lot of controversy about actually using headphones for monitoring. All that aside, it's important to listen to reference material. That is, audio programming that you know well, whether that be music. If you're doing dialogue, you probably want to listen to some dialogue, but dialogue that you really like the sound of, that you've heard on many different systems and you generally know what it should sound like. You should play those back in whatever you're going to be mixing on so that you can come to understand what the strengths and deficiencies of that particular playback system are. So that way, when you're mixing your own material, okay, I already know that these headphones aren't that great, for example, at, their bass response is a little bit weak. That's not really true with these, actually, but some of them, or their bass response is a little bit hyped. They have a little bit more bass than is actually there in reality. Those are the kind of things that you need to listen to reference material on your playback system so you know what the characteristics are, so that when you're doing your mixing, you're not overcompensating in areas where you shouldn't be overcompensating. You're not adding a bunch of bass where you don't need a bunch of extra bass just because you can't hear it on your system. So just some things to consider. And we will have more on those topics. I'm actually doing a DIY project right now where I'm building some bass traps that I'm going to hang in my room. I have a measurement microphone where we can actually see what kind of difference it actually makes once you start hanging that stuff up. My understanding is, from the reading I've done, you don't probably want to just go out and buy a bunch of acoustical foam and plaster the entire room's walls with that, because the problem with that is that, it's not addressing the biggest issue first, which, and the biggest issue is the lingering bass frequencies typically. But that's actually taking care of the higher frequency problems, but you're still left with the big bass issues. And you don't necessarily want to absorb all of the high frequency stuff, especially if you're still not attenuating any of the bass stuff. So anyway, I'm working on these bass traps, and I need to find the fabric for them now. That's my next step. As far as the material that I'm using in them, they're actually probably more broadband traps. And I don't know how much bass they're really going to capture. We'll see. This is a big experiment. But I'm using what's called rock wool, and it's the softer kind of rock wool that you would actually put in your walls to soundproof walls. It does have a noise reduction coefficient, but it's not real clear. And when I looked at it, it does attenuate some bass frequencies, but not. It's not the highest quality stuff you could use for that, but you can buy it at some hardware stores. So anyway, that's the material inside. I built the wood frames. Now I have to buy the fabric to put over it. And the fabric, I want to buy the right kind of fabric so it doesn't reflect the sound, but it actually lets the sound pass through so it can be absorbed. So kind of a burlap style fabric is what you're looking for, a very loose weave with a natural fiber. So that's the next step, and I'll keep you updated as we get closer on that. So that was everything I had prepared for today. It doesn't look like we have any other questions right now, so we'll probably go ahead and wrap this session up just a couple of minutes early. I'd like to thank everyone for the support they've given the sessions here. the questions that we've had. Really appreciate those as well. And for those that weren't able to attend, next week we'll rotate the time. So I think right now this is probably a better time for, well, I don't know who it's a good time for. Gary, who was here earlier, is in Australia. So um, again, we'll keep rotating the times on these so that we can hopefully accommodate most people. And we'll talk to you guys again next week.